The weight of salt. Once upon a time, there was a man who had never once asked for help. His name was Silas, and his hands told you everything you needed to know about him before he opened his mouth. The knuckles were cracked so deep the lines looked carved rather than worn, and the skin of his palms had gone the color of old wax. White and faintly translucent, pickled through 30 years of salt, the way a thing gets pickled when it has been submerged long enough that the brine becomes its nature. He had stopped feeling the sting sometime in the second decade, or so he told himself. The truth was more complicated, the way truth usually is with proud men. He lived and worked in the Low Basin, which was not a place anyone came to by choice. The valley sat below the surrounding land, the way a bowl sits below a table, catching everything that fell, holding it, offering no drainage. The salt mines ran beneath it like a system of veins, dark and low-ceilinged and wet with mineral seep, and the air above ground tasted of it too, so that a man new to the basin would spend his first weeks wiping his lips constantly, surprised each time by the flavor. Old-timers like Silas had stopped noticing. The salt was simply the medium they moved through, the way fish move through water without thinking about water. The basin had one exit. Everyone knew this. Up the long switchback road that climbed the eastern wall of the valley, past the great scales, and out into what they called the high country, which no one from the basin had seen, but everyone had heard described in terms that varied depending on who was doing the describing and how long they had been underground. Green, most agreed, air that didn't taste of anything, light that came from above rather than from lamps. The great scales stood at the base of the eastern road like a gate that had learned to judge. The iron was old and red, with rust and immovable, bolted to a stone platform that had been there longer than anyone's memory. The magistrates maintained it, lean, grey-coated men who never smiled and never spoke beyond what was necessary. The mechanism was simple. A citizen placed their life's work on the left pan, the magistrate placed the king's standard weight on the right, and the beam either tipped or it didn't. Those whose work outweighed the standard were given passage. Those whose work fell short were turned back into the valley. In 30 years, Silas had never seen anyone pass. He had also, in 30 years, never once doubted that he would be the first. The canvas sack went everywhere with him. It was large enough that smaller men sometimes stopped and stared when he hauled it through the basin's narrow streets, a great rough-sided thing darkened with age and use, bulging with the purest salt he had ever pulled from the deep seams. He had been selecting for 3 decades. Only the clearest crystals, the heaviest concentrations, the salt that caught even the basin's dim light and threw it back white and sharp. Inferior product he left for other men or traded for necessities. The best, always, went into the sack. He did not steal, he did not lie, he did not, as a rule, speak ill of his neighbors, though he permitted himself a low opinion of men who left their work unfinished or their tools uncared for. He paid his debts the same day they were incurred. He had worked through illness, through the death of a brother, through 2 cave-ins that had left other men changed in ways they couldn't name. Silas had emerged from both with salt on his hands and the sack slung over his shoulder, and had gone back down the next morning. He was, by any measure he understood, a good man. He had the sack to prove it. The day he brought it to the scales was a grey morning in early autumn, the kind that felt like a held breath. He had risen before light and dressed deliberately, the way a man dresses when he knows the day is significant. He had not slept well. This he attributed to excitement rather than to the faint unease that had been sitting in his chest for the last several weeks. An unease he had not examined closely, because close examination of unease was not something Silas did. The sack was heavier than it had ever been. He felt it in his lower back on the walk to the scales, a deep, satisfying ache. This was the weight of his life made physical. He had earned every crystal. He had bled for several of them, actually. The cuts on his hands were always there, always fresh, the salt finding them with the particular cruelty of salt and lighting them up every time he reached into a new seam. He had learned to work through the sting. He was proud of this, in the way he was proud of all his endurances. A small crowd had gathered, as crowds do when something has been anticipated long enough to become common knowledge. Silas ignored them. He approached the stone platform with the sack over one shoulder and set it down before the magistrate, a tall grey man whose face had the quality of something that had never been young, and straightened his back. "I'm ready," Silas said. The magistrate said nothing. He gestured toward the left pan. Silas lifted the sack. His hands ached with the weight of it. He set it on the pan, and the iron groaned with the mass of 30 years, and the left side actually dipped, a visible movement, and Silas felt something open in his chest that might have been joy. Then the magistrate turned to the right side of the beam. He reached beneath the platform and lifted the king's standard weight, and Silas's first thought was that it was small. It was a block of something dark and dense, no larger than a man's fist, and it had the quality of absolute stillness that very heavy things have. The magistrate placed it on the right pan without ceremony. The beam moved. The right side went down like a stone dropped in water. Not slowly, not with any drama, but with the simple decisiveness of something that has never been in question. The left pan flew upward, and Silas's sack, 30 years of the purest salt in the low basin, rose with it as though it weighed nothing, as though it were a child's toy, as though all of it, all the bleeding mornings and the cave-ins and the ache in his back and the 30 years of choosing only the best, as though all of it were, against the weight on the other side, essentially air. The sack hit the top of its arc and tipped. Salt poured from the loosened drawstring in a white cascade, and the wind that ran along the base of the eastern wall caught it and threw it sideways, directly into Silas's face. It hit his eyes first. The sting was immediate and total, the kind of pain that whites out thought, and he reeled back with both hands pressed to his face. Then his hands, the cracked, open, wounded hands he had worked through for 3 decades, registered what was on them, and the sting there was worse, if anything, than in his eyes. The salt found every cut simultaneously, as though it had been waiting, as though it had always known exactly where he was most open, and it burned with the focused attention of something personal. He stood at the base of the great scales with his hands over his face and his eyes running and his life's work dissolving into the dirt around his boots, and for the first time in 30 years, Silas had no idea what to do. The crowd was silent. He heard his own breathing. He heard the wind. He heard the small sound of salt crystals settling on stone. He lowered his hands slowly and looked at them. The white, pickled, cracked open hands, and something moved through him that was not anger, though it had anger's heat. It was worse than anger. It was the specific anguish of a man who has built his entire architecture of self on a foundation that has just quietly and without apology proven insufficient. "This isn't right," he said. His voice came out wrong, thinner than he intended. "This can't be right. 30 years. Do you understand what I have given? The standard does not change," the magistrate said. He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. He said it the way a man states the temperature outside. Simply. Finally. Silas looked at the empty pan on the left. He looked at the small dark block on the right. Still perfectly. Terribly still. He looked at his salt in the dirt, already being scattered further by the wind, already becoming indistinguishable from the ordinary salt dust that coated every surface in the low basin. 30 years of distinction, 30 years of selection, becoming ordinary in a matter of seconds. He became aware of someone standing beside him. The man was not from the basin. You could tell immediately, the way you can always tell. Something about the way he stood in the air, as though the air were not a burden to him. His clothes were plain and travel-worn, but he did not have the grey cast that basin men got, the mineral pallor. He looked like a man who had seen light that came from above. He held something in his closed fist. "I've been watching you work," the man said. He said it simply, without flattery in it, which was what made Silas listen. "For longer than you know." Silas said nothing. His hands were still burning. "I have something that will balance the scale." The man opened his hand. It was a wooden token, small enough to sit in the palm with room around it. Dark wood, old, and across one face of it a stain that was unmistakably the brown red of old blood. It looked like nothing. It looked like the most inadequate thing Silas had ever seen in 30 years of measuring weight and worth. "That," Silas said, and his voice had recovered some of its edge, "will not balance anything." "No," the man agreed, "not by its own weight." "Then it was paid for by someone else." The man's eyes were steady in the way that the king's standard weight was steady, a stillness that had nothing to prove. "The cost was already settled. The weight has already been accounted for. This is only the receipt." Silas looked at it. He looked at his empty pan. He looked at his salt in the dirt. "I have to dump all of it," he said. Not a question. Understanding arriving the way unwelcome things arrive, all at once. "Yes, and hold out empty hands." "Yes." The word landed in Silas like the sting of salt in an open cut, which is to say, it found every wound simultaneously, and it was the sharpest thing he had felt in 30 years. Because this was the thing Silas had never done. He had worked through illness and grief and darkness and pain, and all of it had been, in its way, a form of keeping his hands full, of never being caught without something to show, of never standing before anyone, man or magistrate or king, with nothing but himself and the bare fact of his need. He looked at the token. He looked at his hands. The salt in the cuts was still burning. He thought about going back down. He had done it before, after cave-ins, after losses, after the worst mornings. He could go back down. He could fill another sack. He could spend another decade selecting only the best and come back with even more and try again. And the beam would do the same thing it had just done, and the wind would come again, and he knew. He had always, somewhere very quiet and very buried, known. His knees hit the stone platform before he fully decided to kneel. It was his body's understanding arriving ahead of his pride's surrender. He reached out and took the token from the man's open palm. It was lighter than he expected and heavier, and he held it for a moment and felt the old burning in his hands, and then, slowly, he leaned forward and placed it on the empty iron pan. The beam moved, not violently. Not with the drama of the king's weight dropping. It moved the way dawn moves, gradually, and then all at once, and then it was simply the new reality, the new arrangement of the world. The left pan descended, the right pan rose. The magistrate looked at the beam for a long moment and then looked at Silas and stepped aside from the road. Silas stood up slowly. His knees ached. His hands ached. His eyes were still raw from the salt. He looked at his life's work in the dirt, at the white powder of it already settling, already becoming part of the basin floor. He did not pick any of it up. He turned to the man to say what he didn't know, because he had no words yet for what had just happened to him, and he was not a man who spoke before he had words, but the man was already looking up the road, and something in the set of his face suggested he had done this before and was glad to do it again every time, without calculation. "The hands heal faster," the man said, "once you stop working them before they're ready." Silas looked down at the cuts. He had not thought of them as wounds in years. He had thought of them as the cost of the work, which was a different thing. He now understood, or beginning to understand, the way you begin to understand something large, which is slowly and with your whole body. He took one step up the road, then another. The road climbed steeply, and his back still ached, and his hands still burned, and he had nothing to carry. He had never in 30 years walked unburdened. It was terrifying. It was the first true step he had ever taken. He kept walking.